Oh, hello. Welcome to Stuhr Museum for the first annual What Do You Know event. We're here live at Stuhr Museum tonight, and tonight we're going to have 5 8 to 10 minute presentations dealing with general knowledge, informational topics that we hope everyone can find something to enjoy from. The topics are going to include beer brewing, dowsing, voice creation, street light restoration, and also time travel. If you'd like to see other events like this, keep in mind this is a free event, but if you'd like to help us out, head over to the Stuhr Museum Facebook page or stuhrmuseum.org/donate in order to help ensure that we have events like this moving forward. Our first speaker tonight is going to be Alex Breiner over at Prairie Pride Brewing here in Grand Island, Nebraska. But before I turn it over to Alex Breiner, I'm just going to introduce a little fun fact about the history of brewing to get things going. So everyone knows who George Washington is. But a few of you might not know that before he was the famous general and president that we all know and love, he was a up-and-coming struggling politician who had twice lost an attempt to win a seat in the Virginia House of Burgesses. And in 1758, he was finally learning to play the political game when he bought 140 to 160 barrels of both beer and whiskey in order to influence voters at the polls. In a tradition known as swilling the planters with bumbo, which refers to a type of rum at the time, he set up workers at the polling place to ensure people who happened to stop by that their drinks would be covered if they sent a vote towards old George. So with that little bit of history behind us, I'm gonna crack open a beer, turn it over to Alex Breiner over at Prairie Pride, and get things started off right. Alex.
Pride Brewing Company, and I'm also a partner of the brewery as well.
Cool.
And I'm going to be talking about brewing beer. So, brewing beer is basically converting grain starches into sugar, and the yeast does the rest of the work for us and turns that sugar into alcohol by converting those sugars into both alcohol and CO2. So what we try to do is convert those starches as efficiently as possible, as well as creating a nice home and living environment for the yeast to live in to do the rest of the work for us. So I like to say I'm pretty much the janitor of making the beer. I clean everything and make everything ready for the yeast to do the real work. So to brew beer, basically you first got to get that conversion happening from the starches into the sugars. So we have a mash tun. And a mash tun is basically where all that grain that we're going to use to get the sugars out of, we put that in this mash tun, which would be, from a home brewing perspective, people use a water cooler with a screen on the bottom. Or you can use a big vessel like we have over there. That's our mash tun. That holds about 500 gallons. So that's a bigger capacity mash tun. And what you do is you add hot water to grain, and that hot water will react with the malted barley or malted wheat or rye, what have you, in your grain to convert those starches into sugars. And that happens over the course of about an hour. And what's happening is there's amylase, some enzymes in your malted barley, and that helps react with the starches to convert that over to sugars once warm water is added. So there's the mash tun. We'll go back to barley a little bit here in a little bit, but then you've got to have the boil kettle. This is where you boil everything and you add your hops, and then after that you've got to cool everything down. After it's been boiling, you want to cool that wort. We call it wort. The brewers call it basically unfermented beer, wort. So we're going to use the term wort. So we cool that wort down as fast as we can, and then we add the yeast and ferment it. Okay, so you got to have the mash tun. You got to have the boil kettle. A thermometer helps for keeping track of your temperatures. You got to have a fermenter, which could be a 5-gallon bucket that with an airlock on it that you can ferment it, or it could be a large stainless steel conical like we have in the back on the other side of this wall here. So it can be as small as 5 gallons. You can go as big as 10,000 gallons, depending on what size you want to brew. Okay, so brewing is a pretty fun hobby to get into. It's pretty inexpensive to get into, and that's how I got started in brewing beer. My first beer was an Irish Red.
Really?
Yep.
Well, why that one?
I was just walking around in a northern suburb, downtown area of Chicago, and I don't even remember where I was going, but I saw a homebrew store. So I went into the homebrew store and got all the equipment, and they have these kits of the different varieties of beer, and I don't know if I was drinking Irish Red recently before that, but for some reason I picked the Irish Red recipe and I brewed it, and somehow it didn't totally stink. I actually enjoyed it, and that encouraged me to read everything I could and learn everything I could about brewing. Going back to, we talked a little bit about malted barley. That's just one of the main brewing ingredients. Besides malted barley, obviously you got water, you gotta have water, and then you've got yeast, and you've got hops as well. Those all are pretty important in the brewing, and that's how pretty much all the beer recipes have started, was with those ingredients, but now we've also started adding fruits and spices to make even crazier, wilder, more extraordinary beers. So going back to malted barley. So malted barley is what's used most often to get your sugars for the yeast to eat and make your alcohol. But you can use many other different types of grains. You can use rice, corn, wheat, but it's got to be malted to get that enzyme that will actually convert those starches into sugars. If you don't have that, such as if you were going to make some American lager, like we're going to brew tomorrow, you've got your corn, which isn't malted, but you might boil that corn and break it down and then add malted barley and borrow some of those enzymes from that malted barley to convert the starches into corn to make your sugar solution called wort that will eventually turn into alcohol. Okay? Then you've got your hops. So your hops, that adds bitterness to an otherwise very sweet beer. Beer is very sweet without the hops. Even your not very hoppy beers like your High Life or your Budweiser, they've still got hops in them, because without that, the beer would be just uncomfortably sweet. So you've got to balance that out with some bitterness. That's where hops come in. Hops are also useful in preserving your beer and making it so it lasts longer. It's a natural preservative and adds to the acidity of beer as well. So it's pretty useful for that. There's not really a lot of other uses for hops besides being used in beer. Okay, so we talked about all the ingredients, and now what we're going to do is talk about the actual process of making that beer. So essentially what you're going to do is first you got to get your conversion going. So you get your mash tun, which we talked about a little bit. You'll get your mash tun, and you'll convert your starches and sugars in there by steeping your grains. You're basically making a tea. You're going to steep your tea, your grains, in that hot water, about 150 degrees, and you let that sit for about an hour. And during that time, your starches will turn into sugars, and you'll eventually, once that's happened, then you're just going to basically strain off. Basically, you'll strain off the sugars from the grain, leave the grain behind, and all of that sugary water that we call wort is going to go into the boil kettle. From there, you've done most of the work. Okay, now you're just going to boil that wort for about an hour. On most recipes, are about an hour of boil. During that time, you'll add hops. Now, adding hops at different times makes a difference. If you add your hops at the beginning of the boil, you're going to get more bitterness out of the hops. If you add it towards the end of the boil, you're going to get more aroma or flavors out of the hops. And then different hops, hop varieties are better at different things. Some are better at the bittering, some are better at the aroma part. So depending on what kind of recipe you want, you'll add the hops at a different time. Okay? Then after you've boiled, what you're going to do is you're going to cool that wort down, get it as cool as you can, to about room temperature, as fast as you can. And then once you've done that, you're going to bring it over and put it into a fermenter, either one of our 5-gallon buckets for a homebrew or a big conical for a professional brewery. And then you're going to add your yeast, and you'll try to keep that wort at about 68, 70 degrees for an ale, or maybe 50 degrees for a lager, and then you're going to let it ferment out. That's one more thing I want to talk about. There's a difference between ales and lagers, and the only difference is the yeast you use and what temperature you fermented at. So I've heard so many different things, that's an ale, or that's a lager because it's light. Doesn't matter. Both ales and lagers can be hoppy or dark or light. It just depends on the yeast. If it's a top fermenting yeast or a bottom fermenting yeast and what temperature it ferments at. So that's the only real difference between the two.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So after it's fermented for about a week for an ale or a month for a lager, and then you go maybe age it for another week after that just to get the beer a little bit better, what you're going to do is you're going to cool that beer down, let all the hops and any proteins that are still in the beer, that'll sink down to the bottom. You'll suck off everything else and put it into another container that you're going to carbonate the beer off of, and then bottle it or keg it, and then it's ready to serve.
Thank you for that, Alex. Our second presentation tonight is going to be with Carly Kramers, who's going to be discussing the concept of voice creation for characters. One voice creation of note that the Stuhr Museum interprets here is the brainchild of Edgar Bergen, who was a ventriloquist from the 1930s to the 1970s. His creation of Charlie McCarthy led to a 40-year career spanning radio programs, television series, and countless movies that even won Bergen an Academy Award for Outstanding Comedic Creation in 1937. That special Oscar was wooden, and it had a movable mouth to symbolize the importance of this breakthrough. We're now going to head over to Carly Kramers, and she's going to talk to us more about voice creation. Carly?
And I work here at Stuhr Museum, and today we are going to be talking about voices. I'm going to break down the process of developing a voice for different kinds of characters so that whether you are an actor or play games such as Dungeons and Dragons where you create characters or just want to spice up the bedtime story that you read to your kiddos, this is going to be a fun process that anyone can use. So a little bit about me first is I have a Bachelor's of Arts in Theater from Hastings College, and I am also currently the puppeteer for Scout, the youth ambassador here at the Stuhr Museum. I created Scout in July, and although I've acted many times on stage, this was my first time being in control of a puppet. So I knew that creating a voice that was very distinct to Scout and evoked a certain emotion was important. So I went on a process for a perfect voice. Now, some people may think, what's the big deal about creating a certain kind of voice? Well, if I were to tell you, I'm acting as a dog right now, and then I just go, woof, 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 woof. Now, although that could be a fun, satirical version of a dog, it doesn't sound like a dog to anyone. It's not believable. So, it's important to come up with a voice that fits your character to make it come to life. On this voice voyage, we're going to go over 3 different steps. We are going to observe so that we understand different vocal qualities and how they evoke certain emotions. Then we are going to utilize our tools, such as our voices, and then we are going to play around a little bit with those different voices. So for that first step, we need to observe different vocal qualities and how they have certain emotional connotations. So, for example, let's think of an iconic character that we all know of. So, Mickey Mouse. When you think of Mickey Mouse's voice, do you think of an angry or a sad voice? No, you think of a happy voice, very jolly and jovial and fun. But let's switch it up and let's think of a different voice like Batman. Do we think Batman has the same emotions? Not at all. It's very dark and intimidating and intense. So how do these different voices in and of themselves carry such different emotional ranges? Well, that's where breaking down different vocal qualities really helps out. So let's start with pitch. For anyone that doesn't know, when you have pitch, it's either really, really high or really, really low, or anywhere in between of that. Then you have speed, where I could be talking really, really fast and talking really intense about something, or I could be talking very slowly about something. And then there's the weight of the voice, which might be a little harder for some people to grasp. But basically, you either have a strong voice that has a lot of grounding and a lot of depth, or you might have a lighter voice that might be a little quiet. And then there's also flow, which pertains to energy. So if you have a bound flow, then there's a lot of intensity behind it, like you're holding something back and you are trying to not let it go, or it's just free, which could be either light and airy or just someone just being loud and free and not holding anything back. And then there is where that sound comes from. So you could have the sound coming from your nose. It's very nasally. You might remember Fran Drescher, very that. Or it could be coming from your head. So it's a little bit lighter. For me, that's where I talk a lot from. Or you could talk from your voice, from your throat. So it's a little bit down there more, a little bit wider, has a different sound. And then there are many other places that your voice can come from, but those are the main three we'll talk about today. And then obviously you have other things such as accents or unique vocal qualities besides that, but let's just focus on these 5 for now. So going back to the Mickey Mouse example, would you say that Mickey Mouse has a high pitch or a low pitch? We're going to say he has a high pitch, and this is the best Mickey Mouse I can do. I didn't say I was teaching you impressions. For the speed of Mickey Mouse, I would say that it's kind of a little bit on the fast side. Not super fast, but a little bit fast, definitely not slow. And then the weight of it is very light and bouncy, like you can picture a bouncing ball just going all around, very happy. Ha ha ha. And then for the flow of it, it's very free, nothing holding back. And right now I'm using very much my throat back here. So that was my Mickey Mouse. So sorry to put you through that. But you can see how you connect the dots of high pitch, fast, light, and free, and then a little bit of the throat. You get something that sounds happy, just in and of itself. I'm not Mickey Mouse, but I had quite a happy voice there. But then if you go to Batman, we're not going to do that. I'm not going to Batman. But we all know what Batman sounds like. It's a low pitch. It's a gravelly pitch. The speed of Batman's voice kind of can depend a little bit, but it's fairly in the middle, which shows us that the speed of Batman's voice doesn't necessarily have a lot of weight in the connotation of the emotions. But with the weight, it's very strong. It's very grounded. And then I would say that the flow is bound, where it feels like there's always that intensity behind there that isn't completely being let out, but is trying to be restrained. And then with the graveliness of it, you can definitely think of it as a throat sound coming out of there. So going back to when I was creating Scout. When I was creating Scout, I wanted Scout to be a character that was childish, so I picked a high pitch. I wanted Scout to be a character that was excited about everything, so I picked a fast speed. I wanted Scout to just kind of be all over the place and very Scout, no matter what, very present. So it actually had a strong weight to it, which some people may think that it can only be strong and low, but you can have a strong and a high pitched. But then I would say that the flow is very free, where Scout isn't holding anything back. It is all out there. And then I do a little bit mix of nose and head. So when I combine all of this stuff, it sounds like a child that's just at a museum and is so eager to learn anything and everything, and wow! So if I would have said that in my Carly voice, it wouldn't have had that same level of excitement. But having that different voice really makes Scout come alive. So now that we have this knowledge, we're going to utilize our tools, so that includes our voices. The thing I can't stress enough is that if it hurts to make that voice, don't do it. It's not worth it. If you're an actor and you're like, but I came up with the perfect voice for this character, it doesn't matter. You won't have a voice when it comes to performance time, so it's not worth it. And oftentimes, it just takes a little bit of a tweak, either mentally or where you're promoting that sound from, in order to make it unhealthy to healthy. So there are some vocal exercises that you can do, such as a lip trill. So if you pretend you're a horse, and then you add some tone to it, and you go, that helps loosen up your uvula, which is a little dangly thing in the back of your throat. And then it also makes it so that all of your projection is coming from your breath. Lots of people think that if you project with your throat, that's where it comes from, but that's where you hurt yourself. So if you deep breathe to your diaphragm, and then let all that air project your sound, that's where you're going to have the most success and the most projection. There are also different tongue twisters you can do to warm yourself up, such as unique New York, or red leather, yellow leather, red leather, yellow leather. And there are many others if you look up that you can do. But once you kind of get your voice all warmed up and you have the knowledge that we previously discussed, then you can just use your imagination and play around. Lots of times people have a fear that if they don't get it right on the head the first time, that they failed, and that's couldn't be further from the truth. You have to experiment with lots of different voices in order to find what truly matches your character. And throughout all of this process, I'm assuming that you already either know your character or have developed it or have studied it. So you should understand all the emotions you need to portray with that character. So when you want to practice different voices, just find a safe space where you feel like you can make whatever sound out of your body and no one's there to judge you, such as in your car. You can even sing to songs in your car, so then that way your head isn't all wrapped up in what am I going to say as I test this voice. You can just sing along in weird, funny voices. Or you can do like I do, and I talk to my cat in funny voices. I'm sure she's annoyed, but it's okay. We have a good time. So as you can see, there are many ways that you can just experiment with different voices. And if it turns out weird, it's not that you failed. You just need to connect different dots. So to recap everything we talked about for the voice voyage, observing how different vocal qualities connect to emotional connotations. Then we talked about how to utilize these tools in a healthy way. And then we talked about how you can just have fun and play with these until you find whatever makes your character come alive. So I hope that this will help all of you figure out whatever the perfect woof is for your character. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Carly. Our third presentation for the night hopefully will shine a light on the world of restoration. Streetlights have been with us since the 4th century BC. Ever since that time, in the great city of Antioch in the Greek Empire, there have been some form of streetlights dotting the skies across the world. Whether they be in kerosene form, oil, electric, etc., there have been streetlights. But there are few characters of note, who are drawn like a moth to the flame to restoring these beautiful, one-of-a-kind streetlights. One such character is Don Diedemeyer, and he is the focus of our next presentation on the restoration of streetlights. Don?
Talk to you today about a hobby gone wrong. I started restoring antique streetlights, commercial heavy-duty streetlights back in the 1970s, and I really got interested because of such a huge variety of streetlights. Everybody had their different idea around the country of what a streetlight was, and a lot of technological difference, how technology tied into the development of the streetlight. The streetlights I have restored, basically the ones I like are the cast iron and the iron ones from about the 1890s up to about 1940s is what the old style streetlights like you see in the old movies. As a little background, like I say, I was always fascinated about streetlights because there's a lot of history behind streetlights. Streetlights for many centuries, the outside lighting. It started out had a streetlight back in the 1800s, and it was grease or cooking oil, and it was like a tin fixture, and they were used outside lighting for homes, for businesses, for stables, any place that they needed light, but it's just like lard or grease that they used. In the 1860s, for a short period, they had candle streetlights, and I guess I didn't realize this, but candles really wasn't a commercial product until right before the Civil War. But the candle lit streetlights, they didn't put out a whole lot of light, but you used up your candles. But candles were short-lived. In 1859, the biggest technological advancement in lighting came with the refining of liquid petroleum into kerosene, and kerosene had been made out of coal as well. The early kerosene was kind of smelly, smoky, and they call it skunk oil. And but as years went on, they got the refining process down to where in 1870 they came up with the kerosene lamp. Dietz had an outside street light that ran on kerosene, and those were incredibly popular, and that led into all the homes having kerosene lamps as well. This is the first street light I had was a George Cutter. It came out of Indiana. And always liked it when I had some provenance. I was sitting on I was shingling a roof. I live out by Emic Acres. And I looked across the field, and here was a barn, and here was 4 streetlights, poles sitting against the building. So I went over and looked, and I found these lights, and they had incredible fancy heads. And I talked to my neighbor, Carl Amick, and he says, I'll tell you what, you fix 2 of those lights up for me in my yard, you can have the other 2. Well, that's where it all began. And these would have been cast iron lights. And I found out later in my research, I've had about 6 of these, and these were actually used in Grand Island. And the lights I had came from in front of Rudy Keister, Keister's Lake. It was in front of his butcher shop downtown. So that was kind of the deal there. So that was 1905, so that had been a carbon filament lamp. Now this is the Wells backlight I spoke about. This Wells backlight had a twisted pole. It's kind of a neat deal. And here I'll show you the base. A lot of street lights had the manufacturer's name on the base. And like I said, this is about 1890s that they came out with these Wells backlights. And they're cast iron. And they actually went down in the ground and the gas lines went up through it. And the Wells back had the gas mantle. This is an interesting light. Anytime I have any provenance or history to a light that I can tie down, and I love it. And this light I bought was 1890s, and it was from San Francisco. And you'll notice on this one had a bar on the top for the lamplighter to put his ladder on there to clean the globe, light the lamp, whatever. But I always thought to myself, well, this one was in place when the San Francisco earthquake was around. Now this here is the oldest light that I have, that I think I've ever had. It is 1893. It came from Detroit. And this is an interesting light because it's probably 20 foot tall. The bottom was cast iron, and it had a wood pole that went up through the cast iron light, and then it had a headpiece, and it had carbide. This is one of those carbide lights I was talking about with the burning carbide rods. This was an interesting light. I looked for 5 years. This one had a finial, looked like a bowling pin on top, and I finally found that. So it was kind of like looking for treasure. I find a lot of lights one at a time, but I really get excited when I find a bunch. Now these came out of Hubbard, Ohio. There's a set of 6 lights. They're kind of a claw-footed light. They got 5 globes. And this is a style light that had a rolled steel pole. And so it's pretty fancy. This style light is probably about 12 foot tall all put together. And a lot of this style light here you'd find in front of courthouses, public buildings, libraries. So it is in the process of fixing that. Trouble with street lights, it's very incredibly labor intensive to restore street lights. This set of lights here, I bought these, and I bought them out of Ohio, and I had them shipped back here. When street lights in the old days, over the years, the screws and the bolts would rust together, and get loosened up. Well, the cities, they had a tendency to tack weld. Instead of putting new bolts in it, they'd just tack weld all the joints together. And unfortunately, these lights, this guy was possessed by the devil. He did full welds around every part. It took me 40 hours to cut all the welds off of here, because I take everything apart and then I sandblast them. This is a really interesting light I restored over the years. It's a 1903 Milwaukee Harp light. And what I found fascinating about this is the gas lamp, and it had what's called a holophane globe. And it had stained glass around the perimeter, and it's kind of, you think about maybe concrete poles as being something modern, but these lights were on concrete poles. They used ground up granite, and they formed in the concrete and made a concrete pole. And I'll show you one of those right there. There's a Milwaukee Harp light. But I always loved that. Later on, they're electric, but I had a lot of the gas lights, and just really an unusual lights. And there again, I used to collect lights in Nebraska, and then when the collector news or eBay was the bane of me, or my travels, I'd see a lot of different kind of lights. Every part of the country kind of had a different style lights. It's kind of like the old cigar factory. Every town had a foundry, and so a lot of people had different style lights. Here's an interesting pair of lights. This is the 1930s. There again, I like provenance and history. These came off the Brooklyn Bridge in the 1930s, and you can see these are cast iron with aluminum tops, and you can see that Art Deco styling, and they'd have been at the base of the bridge on a bridge pier. So that's about it. I continue to look for lights. It's kind of I need to get into pocket watches or postage stamps because they're awfully darn heavy, and anymore it costs me much. I buy them across the country, and it costs me just as much to get them back as I do to purchase them. But anyway, it's kind of been a lot of fun over the years, and I've had hundreds of lights I've restored, and it's just like I say, I get a fix on history, and I can put them in a place, in settings like I did a power plant in Kearney, Nebraska, the old power plant. They wanted to put 13 street lights, so I worked with them to put 13 street lights in the spillway by the power plant. So anyway, I get approached by a lot of people, and I find a light for them or for an architectural type setting, and it's just been incredibly enjoyable, and maybe not something anybody else would want to do. It's kind of labor intensive, and it's a non-profit kind of thing, but it's been very enjoyable for me. On Dietermeyer.
Oh, hello again. Our next presentation is going to feature the subject of dowsing or divination. This ancient practice has been found all over the world, and people have sought treasure and fortune from everything from coal, gold, silver, even dead bodies with this ancient practice known as dowsing. Michelle Setlick is going to be our presenter for this portion of the event, but I just wanted to first send a brief reminder out there that you still have a chance to donate over at stuhrmuseum.org/donate, or you can do it so on our Facebook page. So without further ado, Divining with Michelle Setlick.
County Historical Society, and I know about dowsing. Dowsing is actually an ancient practice. It's been around for centuries. In fact, there's Egyptian hieroglyphics that show someone using a divining rod, and there's references in the Bible to divining rods as well. So it's been around for a long, long time. And dowsing, you can use dowsing rods for a lot of things. You might have heard of people using dowsing rods to find water. Maybe some of the pioneers that came through here, they were trying to find wells, and they used dowsing rods for water. We can also use dowsing rods to find graves. Dowsing rods have been used to find mineral deposits, water, and then we also have a gentleman over in Merritt County who used dowsing rods to find trails, the wagon trails, the hand cart trails from the Mormon Trail. So dowsing rods can pick up a lot of different things. And there are two different types of dowsing rods that you might see. If you remember from your little House on the Prairie books, you might have seen our dowsing rod that looked like a V shape that was a piece of wood. It was a V shape from at a straight piece, and then a V-shaped handle they held on to. The rods I use are actually copper rods, and there's two rods you hold out, and there's a little bend in them, and that's where your hand goes. So again, dowsing rods, they've been around forever, and you might have heard words like divining or dowsing, or maybe even witching. And whatever word you use, people have been, like I said, using it for centuries. In the 1500s, Martin Luther, who was the head of the Protestant movement, there were a lot of people in Germany using dowsing rods to find mineral deposits, and Martin Luther deemed it demonic or satanic. And so I think maybe that might be where the idea of the witching came from. I don't know if there's really any mystical, magical reasoning behind the dowsing or how it works. I've heard people talk about potentially the magnetic fields in the earth that it's picking up on, or the breaks in those magnetic fields. Or we were talking about dowsing for graves. There's different properties that we have in our bodies, and that's what the rod is picking up on. So when you're dowsing, what you do is you actually hold both rods out ahead of you, and you just start walking. And when you're dowsing for graves, as you cross the grave, the rods themselves will cross. Obviously, I'm making these cross right now, but when you're walking across the grave, as you cross the grave, the rods cross, and then as you step off the grave, the rods uncross. That's how you can tell if you've located a grave or not. The other thing that you can do with the dowsing rods when you're looking for graves in cemeteries is you can tell if it's an adult or a child that's buried there. And to do that, if you are walking along in the cemetery and you find a grave, you find where either the head or the foot would have been, take a couple steps back and start walking. Again, same thing. When you get to the grave, the body itself, the rods will cross. And then when you're looking at the approximate age of the individual, how many steps it takes you before the rod uncrosses will tell you if it's an adult or child. If it's 5 or 6 steps, probably going to be an adult. If it's a step or 2 or even 3, probably going to be a small child or even an infant. One of the things that I can do with dowsing rods, and not everyone has this ability, but I can find the gender of the person that's buried there. I hold the dowsing rod, I just balance it over my finger, and the rod itself will start moving like a pendulum when I'm over the grave. And if it moves north and south, it's a male. If it moves east and west, it's a female. And I've practiced this and I've demonstrated this countless times, and probably 99% of the time I'm accurate. And you might think, well, it's easier if you're in a cemetery and you know who's buried where, if it's a husband and wife. Actually, what I do is I walk up to the grave with my back to the grave, so I don't know who's buried where. And as I'm standing with my back to the grave, I try to determine the gender and have someone else tell me if I got it right or not before I turn around. So yes, I can tell the gender, the approximate age, and there actually is a person buried there. And we found at the East Grand Island Cemetery, we were going out there with dowsing rods, and we had 3 different people going through with dowsing rods. Each one of us was picking up the exact same thing. Our expectation when we went out there was there were probably about 40 unmarked graves we're going to try to mark. We found over 700 graves using dowsing rods. And again, each one of us had hits at the exact same sites. So when you have 3 people independently doing it, chances are they're probably pretty correct. And once we were able to identify the graves and mark the graves, when the weather allowed, we could actually see changes in the grass that would indicate that there was a grave there. And we used other methods as well that actually told us that there were coffins in those places that we had marked. So we did actually locate 700 graves just using dowsing rods in an unmarked cemetery. One of the things too, the last probably 100 years, there's been a lot of conversation about dowsing and the validity behind it. Like I said, there's a lot of people who will think of dowsing as something scary, magical, like I said, even satanic. But there have been scientific studies of dowsing. And the studies that I've seen have proven both ways. Either they've proven that dowsing does work, or they've proven that dowsing doesn't work. And I don't know. I think if something has been around and we're still talking about it for centuries, and even millennia, there's probably something to it. So we wouldn't still be talking about dowsing, and people wouldn't still be dowsing if there was not something to it that actually worked. So I started dowsing. The Hall County Historical Society, we do a cemetery tour every year at the Grand Island Cemetery. And the person who helps with our tour, that does the symbology part of it, he was using the dowsing rods, and he would have me demonstrate to the crowd how to use the rods as he was talking. And one of the things I found was I could tell the gender. He was explaining how you could tell the gender, but he said that he was not able to. He had never been able to pick up on the gender, but I could pick up on it. So a few days later, at my office, all of a sudden he appeared with my very own set of dowsing rods. So since then, I have my own set of dowsing rods, and like I said, I've doused at cemeteries all around Hall County, and have shown probably hundreds of people how to douse. Again, not everyone can douse, but a lot of people, once they do try it, they do. A lot of people are a little bit, freaked out about it at first, especially when the rods do start moving. They think it's, going to be, we'll give it a try. It's not really going to work. They start walking, all of a sudden the rods start moving. That does kind of freak people out a little bit. There's also something that I see sometimes, like I said, when you walk across and the rods will cross. Some people, and I've heard it called reverse polarity, when they walk across the grave, instead of the rods crossing this way, the rods will wrap around their body. So it is different how the rods react to different people. And
if you would like to try some dowsing rods for yourself or actually see them in practice, come out to the Grand Island Cemetery on Saturday, June 5th. The Hall County Historical Society is going to do our annual cemetery tours, and we will not only demonstrate dowsing rods, but we'll give you the opportunity to try it out for yourself.
What is time? Is it linear? Is it curved? How about time travel? Is there more than one type? Can it be measured? They asked Stephen Hawking about what happened before the Big Bang. And you know what he said? That there was no before the Big Bang, much like there is nothing further south than the South Pole. Because space-time is curved, there can be no before the Big Bang, just like there can be nothing further south than the South Pole. As perplexing as that sounds, I feel like it's about to get even more so with our next presenter. Turner Mcgee is going to be speaking now and last about time travel. Turner?
I'm Turner Mcgee. I'm one of the old professors at Hastings College. In fact, I'm the senior most person who works for the college, not the oldest person, but the person who's worked there the longest at Hastings College. I teach art, and today I find myself in the museum, the Stuhr Museum, and I'm very comfortable in the museum, in the House of the Muses, where I find myself amused and inspired, which is the way that the Greeks thought about these houses of the Muses, places where we went to get inspired. And my inspiration today, I suppose, is one that comes to me a lot, and that is I'm time traveling. I just drove here from Hastings, and I crossed the Platte River, and I saw some of those cranes who, for some vestigial memory, have been coming to exactly the same spot to stop on their migrations for all these millions of years. And somehow they know in their bones exactly where to go and exactly what they need to do here in order to prosper as a species. It's astonishing. It gives me a sense that time is ongoing forever and ever. I do this a lot. I go to other times and places. I know that directly below where I'm sitting, 500 feet down, through the sediments, you will come to the limestone bed that has the bones of animals of the Cretaceous Sea, mosasaurs, pteranodons, animals that used to live here millions and millions of years ago and were alive and were striving, trying to get something to eat, trying to find a mate. They were alive just like we are. My friend Gary Staub, my former student, and close friend, Gary Staub, who's from right here in Grand Island. Probably one of the 3 or 4 most celebrated naturalists, paleontologists, sculptors in the world. He's a guy who I have a lot of conversations with along these lines. Gary accepted a commission from Hastings College to sculpt a prehistoric animal for our science building. And he said, you know, I have molds for 4 or 5 different ones that I've already crafted and built. And you could have one of those if it interests you. You know, I can make one of those for you. But I really want to do a pteranodon. And I said, why? And he said, it's going to hang in front of the window in the Morrison Reeves Science Building at Hastings College. And you'll look past that pteranodon out the window and into that blue sky. And at one time, you would have seen that animal flying by. Probably many of them. We know that because their fossils are here. I haven't done that one. And somehow it seems really vivid to me. That's an experience that I would like to pass on to the students at Hastings College. So I go and stand in front of that pteranodon. There's a second floor balcony where you can look the animal directly in the eye. And I realized one day that that was not just a wonderful reconstruction of a prehistoric animal. It had vitality. I noticed that because the pteranodon is looking very slightly to the left. And I realized that Gary intended to portray the moment when the animal sees its prey. And if you look at the wings, they've just begun to shift their dihedral a few degrees. And that's translated all the way to the feet that are sticking out rearward on that animal. And you can see that there's a little flip going on and that the animal has just begun to shift weight toward the left. I asked Gary how he managed to notice or portray such a subtle thing. And he said, I did it by watching the sandhill cranes. And so, like me, he's somebody who doesn't see a definitive separation between the things that were and the things that are. I had an experience when I was a child. My grandfather was involved in an archaeological expedition in the Valley of Mexico, not far from Mexico City, near Teotihuacan. And I got to be involved myself, too. I think I was maybe 7 years old, and I was given some minor jobs to take clods of earth that had been excavated from the ground and mapped and cataloged and so forth. And I was to wash them with a toothbrush and clean them up and find what little pieces of fragments of sculpture and so forth were there. I'm honored, that I was entrusted to do this as such a small child. And some wonderful things came out of the ground. A hollow ball, ceremonial ball, with sgraffito all over it. But the thing that fascinated me the most was a little figurine, about the size of my hand here. Legs right here, torso right here. And the neck of it, I soon noticed, was the mouthpiece of a musical instrument. And the legs were intact. They were panpipes these were the tuning holes for a pipe, what would you do? I imagine you would have done exactly the thing that I did, which is I blew it. I think this is one of the reasons why I'm an art historian, because in that moment I heard a sound that another human being had heard more than 2,000 years before, and it hadn't been heard since then. And so suddenly it wasn't just an artifact. There was the presence of a human being on the other side of time there. That collapse of time is an experience that I crave, in the same way that I crave the experience that Gary Staub described when he said that he learned how to shift the weight of a pteranodon from looking at the flight of sandhill crane. Well, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and I appreciate the invitation from the museum to talk about whatever I wanted to.
Wow, really compelling. Thank you, Turner. This concludes the first annual What Do You Know event live from Stuhr Museum. We hope you enjoyed yourself, learned something that you can share with your friends. We'd like to do this event at a later day this year, preferably in person. So if you know someone or you yourself are convinced of something along the lines of the Loch Ness Monster is definitely for real, the Denver Broncos are definitely the best football franchise in the history of sports. All these topics and more, anything you can imagine under the sun, are up for debate and discussion in this What Do You Know series. If you'd like to see this again, please feel free to donate over at stuhrmuseum.org/donate or over on our Facebook page. Otherwise, take care. Have a great night. Thanks for joining us.